Good morning, students. Today we continue with our lecture on Orientalism. In the last classes, we talked about the author Edward Said, his background, his life, and then we moved to what does Orientalism say, how it becomes an analysis of modern European colonialism, and why does Orientalism matter. So we have discussed all these things. So it was just a short introduction to Orientalism. Now we move to the next question. Why read this text? As I said earlier, Orientalism, which was published in 1978, is considered to be a core text in the field of post-colonial studies and also in critical theory. It looked at West view of the Orient, particularly Arab and Muslim civilizations. So basically in this text you will see the perspectives from Arab and Muslim civilizations. So it looked at the West view of the Orient, particularly of this civilization through academic work, literature and art. It tries to challenge stereotypical Western view of an Eastern world and culture that was considered inferior. It wanted to show how the world of academia in the West had supported these colonial views and in so doing gave the political powers a kind of intellectual backing to push forward with their colonialist strategies. And what was unusual about Orientalism, the text, when it first appeared, was the fact that it was written by someone who was working at the highest level of US academia. And we have other notable works such as Franz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth and A. Sesay's Discourse on Colonialism, which were completely different from this particular text because of the fact that both these writers were actually living under colonial rule. And along with that, Orientalism was published at a time of great social and political change. By by the late 1970s, we see that the European imperial powers had mainly left their colonies and these countries had become independent nations. It was very much a post colonial world. And there was this Vietnam War which ended in 1975. But some academics were still criticizing the US for a foreign policy they saw as militaristic and aggressive. This foreign policy was sometimes called neo-colonial. Note the word neo-colonial because of the way it still attempts to control other lands but by means other than direct rule. So we have discussed neo-colonialism when we looked through all those concepts. And along with that, in 1972, there was this attack at the Munich Olympics in which a Palestinian group called Black September had killed around 11 Israeli Olympic athletes, which led to some kind of anti Arab feeling. Then in 1973, Israel repelled an attack on its territory by Syria and Egypt. And thanks God, to military aid from the US. And there was this organization of Arab petroleum exporting countries, OAPEC, OPEC, which retaliated by cutting oil supplies to the West, triggering a worldwide economic crisis. Being Americans were the big consumers of Middle Eastern oil, and so this anti-Arab feelings in the US rose again, together with a general sense in the US that Arab identity was linked to terrorist activity, and it still goes on. That kind of an association where this Arab identity is equated with terrorism. And talking about the author's background, we discussed his status when we discussed his life. We said that after finishing his school, he went to study in United States, obtaining a degree from Princeton University and a doctorate in English literature from Harvard University. And Edward Sale saw his school experience repeated at American universities, where again he felt like an outside, an outsider. That's why he said these words. My own experiences of these matters are in part what made me write this book. The life of an Arab Palestinian in the West, particularly in America, is disheartening. The web of racism, cultural stereotypes, political imperialism, and dehumanizing ideology holding in the Arab or the Muslim is very strong indeed. Actually, he found himself in an environment that was hostile to Arabs, Arab ideas, and Arab nations. And this experience brought about a major change in his thinking. He, it is said that he, for the first time, confronted the paradox of his own identity. Because of his educational background, he was very familiar with the wealthy, white, and male world of the elite academia. But his status as an outsider, as a person in exile, still remained. And this Orientalism, this text, emerges out of this world and attacks it from within. So he stands inside US academia and he critiques the system. The text examines the ways that Western academia interacts with the political power to produce a particular worldview. And as you know, Edward Said himself struggled to maintain multiple identities within this world. So he began speaking as a Palestinian again, but from, as I said earlier, but from within the system. In 1963, he joined English and Comparative Literature faculty at Columbia University, and he stayed, as you know, he stayed there until his death in 2003. He was fluent in Arabic, English, and French, and he could read Spanish, German, Italian, and Latin. His academic specialty was in the area of modern European, mostly British literature and literary theory. However, as I said earlier, his exile from his homeland and the sense of displacement and alienation that this caused was at the heart of much of his works. So you should understand that Orientalism was written by a man who intimately understood how the West looked at the Orient and who therefore could see how this distorted what the actual life of an Oriental was. Now we move to the influences of his study. It is said that several different branches of philosophy influenced Edward Said's work and led him to the conclusion that written works are always influenced by the history and politics of the time in which they are written. You know that. And he was particularly influenced by post structuralist theory and philosophy, which described how systems of thought and social organization are built and put into place. We have the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who discusses the concepts of power and discourse, how the systems of thought develop out of verbal interactions, and how they define the way we understand the world. And he discussed these concepts in his two important works, as you know, it is Discipline and Punish and the Archaeology of Knowledge. Here, Foucault particularly looked at how power is underpinned by regulating what can be said, how it can be said, and who can say it. He says that power is regulated by what can be said, how it can be said, and who can say it. To say that Foucault's work was crucial in forming Edward Said's thinking when he wrote Orientalism. That is why Edward Said says text can create not only knowledge but also the very reality they appear to describe. In time, such knowledge and reality produce a tradition, and that is what Michel Foucault calls a discourse. So, text is not something like creation of knowledge, it is actually shaping the reality, it is actually producing the reality, and that is what Michel Foucault calls discourse. And in this particular text, Edward Said is trying to project Orientalism also as a discourse. You will know when we discuss this text. So he takes that idea, the idea of discourse, from Michel Foucault, and he was also influenced by the work of Italian Marxist and political theorist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci actually developed a concept of hegemony. It is how one group can come to dominate another. Gramsci looked at how Europe became industrialized in the late 19th century and he came to the conclusion that this bourgeoisie, capitalist classes, grabbed and held on to power not only through force but also through systems that made sure that the working class, the proletariat, allowed themselves to be dominated. So it is not by the force alone. So we have discussed this idea earlier too, how this colonized is made to internalize the logic that they are inferior when compared to the West. We have discussed these ideas. So, this capitalist class deliberately put forward a worldview that suited them with the express intention of making that view become normal. When that view came to dominate, it meant that all classes in society came to understand themselves from the capitalist point of view. So they made the other believe that this is something natural in quotes. They made it seem natural as well as right, and the elite class dominated everyone else, both economically and politically. So in Orientalism, what we see is said applies the same idea to colonial society, saying that even after the imperial powers have left and have granted their colonies independence, the colonialist intellectual standpoint and the dominance of one group over another still remains. And he has also brought the theories of Jacques Derrida too. So their ideas about how to analyze discourse formed the basis of Edward Said's own approach and allowed him to show how representations of the Orient were full of implied meanings. Now we move to the major ideas in the text. So here Edward Said argues that Orientalism is a system of thought that casts the West as superior and the East as inferior, and thereby justifies the West's domination of the East. Here the text tries to say that the Western view of the East is a fantasy of a world that is unchanging and at the same time exotic. And he tries to say that this idea, this view, bears little resemblance to the complex reality. As I said earlier, because this is a subject that was very personal to him as an Arab and as an intellectual working in the university system, Edward Said makes these arguments openly and forcefully, setting out his ideas clearly at the beginning of the book and then developing those ideas consistently throughout. He lays out his big thinking about Orientalism and the political, economic, and social conditions that it brought about. And he also details the particular stereotypes attached to the Orient in the Orientalist point of view. These stereotypes of Orientalism that Edward Said identifies include seeing the Oriental as fundamentally alien and the other. Also, viewing the Orient as representing aspects of European society that upper class Europeans feared and wished to reject, and also viewed Orient as feminine, meaning weak and in need of help and direction in the Victorian European sense. So here we see that the most important concept is that of the Oriental as someone other, someone who represents the complete opposite of the West. So this Oriental, as I said, I want to elaborate a little on the concept of other. So Oriental becomes a blank canvas for any identity a Westerner might choose. The Oriental was seen as somehow naturally backward, against modernity, morally degenerative, and likely to do things to excess. Thus, this Oriental was often compared to and explicitly associated with degenerate people. As Edward Said explains, the Oriental was linked to elements in Western society, delinquents, the insane, women, the poor, having in common an identity best described as lamentably alien. So Orientals were analyzed not as citizens or even people, but as problems to be solved or confined or taken over. In this view, we see that Orient can be seen as a projection of European social anxieties at the dawn of a new age. It was the modern age of industrial capitalism. This was a time when social structures in the West were undergoing massive changes, and there was this issues such as urban poverty, overpopulation, and there was this public health crisis. Along with that, we have seen the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, the ideas about evolution, which informed Orientalist thought and placed the East as fundamentally backward in terms of scientific progress and human history. Along with that, Edward Said also discussed the strong sexual undertones that are present in this attitude. He tries to identify the erotic tone found in the prose of Orientalist writers as a way of associating the Orient with the Victorian viewpoint of femininity. This view saw females and therefore the Orient itself as fundamentally weak, incapable of thinking or acting for themselves or itself, seductive by nature, yet passive and inviting male intervention and penetration. So, these are the major ideas discussed in the text Orientalism. In the next class, we'll move to the introduction part, to the part which is prescribed in the syllabus. So, I hope you have the text with you. We'll continue with our discussion. So, these are the points which will be elaborated. We have discussed the major points. We have discussed the ideas of other writers, other philosophers, Michel Foucault, Edward Said. So, all these concepts and ideas will be discussed elaborately when we deal with the text. So, this is just an introduction. Please get your copy and be ready for the class, for the next class. Thank you, girls. Have a nice day.